The moment I stepped into the courtroom clutching 5 thin cardboard folders and wearing a baggy $12 polyester suit, I felt my parents roll their eyes as if I were the last person who should be standing in front of a judge, and I watched them from across the room sitting tall, smug, and united with Trayvon next to them, slick as always in a designer suit, his wife Ashley dressed in innocent pastels, and my mother Patricia adjusting her pearl necklace like we were at a garden party instead of a legal proceeding to decide the fate of my $2,200,000 trust fund. And while Sterling, their high-priced attorney, clicked open his briefcase with the air of a man ready to win, I stood alone in silence as if I were too weak or too confused to fight back. But what they did not know was that I was not here to argue or to plead or to beg. I was here to destroy. And those 5 folders were not filled with desperation or rambling defenses. They were my arsenal, and I had waited for this day not with fear, but with strategy, and every moment leading up to this had been carefully chosen, every dollar spent, every move made with purpose. And as I sat in my rusted 2005 Honda Accord that morning, parked 2 blocks away, watching my family arrive in their fleet of luxury cars, and I saw Trayvon step out of his black Range Rover, adjusting his cufflinks, while Ashley played concerned wife and Lawrence and Patricia emerged like royalty, I knew they still believed their illusion was intact. They still believed I was the same boy they once discarded like trash, and I had chosen this oversized suit on purpose, because for over 30 years they had branded me as a failure and a disappointment, and today I was going to let them live in that lie a little longer. And as the judge entered and called the court to order, I rose with everyone else, my ill-fitted jacket bunching at the shoulders, and Sterling stood up with the confidence of a man about to win another easy case, and he began spinning his story of love and concern and mental instability, painting me as a delusional hermit too frugal to live like a normal man. And when he showed a photo of my apartment, a bare mattress, a plywood desk, books stacked high, and no decorations, I stayed silent. When he showed the fridge with just milk, bread, and peanut butter, I remained still. And when he brought up a photo of me on a park bench unwrapping a $4 sand, which the courtroom let out a collective sigh as if my lunch proved I was broken, and I heard Trayvon snicker behind me and Ashley whisper something that made him laugh harder, and my mother let out a shaky sob like a grieving mother mourning her mentally unwell son, and Sterling continued with performative concern, claiming that I was incapable of managing finances, that I was a danger to my own well-being, and that my trust should be controlled, not stolen, of course, just protected. And then came the real blow when he implied that I manipulated Big Mama in her final years, that I whispered lies to her, and used her confusion to convince her to leave the trust solely to me. And as I sat there, my pen cracked in my grip, but I did not move because Sterling had just walked into a trap, and he had no idea that I had Big Mama's journals tucked safely inside folder number 5, written in her own hand, describing every day I took care of her, while my parents traveled on cruises and ignored her calls, and I knew they were painting a picture that would soon shatter because they were so blinded by their own arrogance they could not see the courtroom shifting around them. And when the judge looked at me and asked if I had anything to say, I said nothing. I simply opened folder number 1 and began writing, letting the weight of their lies build heavier and heavier in the room. And Patricia took the stand and wept about how I had always been special, which was her way of calling me slow, and recalled how she and Lawrence sacrificed their dreams for me, working double shifts, hiring tutors, doing everything to make sure I could survive in this world, while in reality, I spent my weekends with Big Mama learning algebra, while my mother went wine tasting with her friends, and every word Patricia spoke was like a sharpened blade dipped in sugar. And then Trayvon took the stand and declared himself a financial genius, the CEO of some shell company called T-Wash Global Enterprises, and he used buzzwords like blockchain and high yield and wealth acceleration, and said he could double my inheritance in 6 months, and mocked my job, saying I worked in the mailroom and made $30,000 a year, and that I would hoard the money out of fear and let it rot. And I wrote down every word on my legal pad, smiling inside because Trayvon had no idea that I was no longer a clerk. I was a senior associate at Davis and White, the very law firm whose mail room I once worked in, and I specialized in complex fraud litigation, and my billable hours alone could pay his rent for a year, and my office overlooked the city skyline from 42nd floor, but I had never told my family because their ignorance was my protection. And then Lawrence stood and delivered a sermon from the witness stand, quoting scripture and speaking of honor and stewardship, and claimed that by hoarding the money, I was breaking sacred family values and acting against God. And I watched him adjust his tie, and I saw the vintage gold Rolex on his wrist, the same watch my grandfather left to me in his will, the same watch that went missing from Big Mom. As safe 3 weeks after she died, the same watch now gleaming in the courtroom under fluorescent lights, and I wrote it down, noting the scratch near the 6 o'clock mark, the same one I used to polish every Sunday before church when I was 10. And then Ashley took the stand and transformed herself into a trembling mother, claiming she was scared of me, that I spoke to her through a locked door about being spied on, and accused me of threatening her children, saying I warned that accidents happened to little kids, and the courtroom gasped, and Trayvon slammed his hand on the table, and the judge's face hardened, and I let the silence stretch because I remembered exactly where I was 2 months ago. At the time she claimed I was pounding on her door, and I had proof in folder 4 that showed I was in New York City, sitting in a deposition with a court reporter and 3 attorneys and a time-stamped hotel check-in to match, and I opened folder 4 and wrote down her lie while Ashley cried on stand, and my mother shook in false despair, and Sterling stood with his arms crossed, believing he had just closed the case. And as the judge asked again if I had legal counsel, I slowly rose from my seat, pushed the chair back, and stood tall, letting the courtroom see me not as the defeated man they expected, but as the professional I had become. And I adjusted my jacket and spoke clearly, saying I would represent myself, and the courtroom held its breath, and even Sterling paused with confusion, and Trayvon laughed behind me and whispered, "Watch, he is going to cry," and the judge leaned forward, and I walked to the front, holding up my bar license, the gold seal catching the light, and the room gasped as I said, I was not only the respondent, I was an attorney licensed to practice in the state of Georgia and in federal courts, and I was also a senior associate in one of the most prestigious firms in Atlanta. And suddenly the silence that followed was not victory, it was fear, because Sterling had just realized that he had underestimated me, and Trayvon looked like he had seen a ghost, and my mother went pale, and Ashley's lips trembled, and I stood tall before the judge and said that this entire petition was fraudulent, malicious, and filled with perjury, and that the people trying to take my trust were not protectors but predators, and that I had evidence to prove everything they denied. And as I opened folder 1 to reveal the first exhibit, I knew the tide had turned, and they could no longer laugh or mock or control the room, because the boy they once threw away had returned, not to ask for a seat at the table, but to flip the entire table over and burn it to the ground, because everything they built was based on lies, and today the truth would stand taller than all of them. As soon as I held up my bar license and the golden seal reflected across the courtroom, I felt the silence shift into disbelief, and then panic, and Trayvon's smirk vanished like fog hit by sunlight, and Ashley's composure cracked as she whispered something frantic to him, while Sterling looked like someone had swapped his trial script with a horror novel, and Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses with new attention, the weariness gone from her face, replaced by sharp, focused intrigue, because now she understood that I was not just another man dragged into court by a manipulative family. I was an attorney licensed in the state of Georgia with years of experience in financial fraud and complex litigation, and I stood in that courtroom no longer as a defendant, but as a wolf standing in the ruins of a broken illusion. And with the judge's permission granted, I picked up folder number 1 and walked toward the bench, not rushing, not stalling, just moving with the confidence of someone who knew every trap door in the floor and every trick that had been played, because I had studied them, prepared for them, even planted some myself. And as I placed the document into the clerk's hand and faced the courtroom. I projected my voice so that no one missed a word, saying that I moved to dismiss this petition with prejudice on the grounds that it was fraudulent, baseless, and dripping in perjury, and the words hit the air like a hammer because no one expected me to speak like that, and certainly not with that calm, lethal tone. And Sterling flinched visibly, and my mother gasped audibly, and I knew I had seized control of the room. And as I turned and pulled out a laminated card with the bar seal, the gallery murmured, and I heard someone in the back whisper, "Oh my God!" And that moment I had dreamed of it for years, not because I wanted revenge in the petty sense, but because I needed the truth to shine unfiltered, unbroken, and unmistakable, and I wanted my family to choke on their own underestimation of me. And the judge leaned forward, and her tone changed as she asked slowly and carefully if I was that Washington, the one who had written the amicus brief in the Henderson fraud case. And when I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I am that Washington, and I have been working at Davis and White as senior associate, specializing in forensic litigation and asset recovery," her eyes lit up with recognition and respect. And Sterling tried to object, claiming ambush, but the judge shut him down immediately. And I turned to Trayvon and said, "Close your mouth, because you are going to need it to answer my questions, and I have a lot of them." And the energy in the courtroom flipped like a coin tossed in midair. And now I will the one asking the questions and the one controlling the tempo. And as I opened folder number 1 again, I took out my tax return and walked over to Sterling's table and dropped it with a hard slap in front of him, and told him to read line 32 aloud. And Sterling hesitated, and his hand shook slightly as he scanned the page, and when he finally whispered $450,000, the weight of the number landed like a punch, and I turned to the courtroom and declared that I was not struggling, not confused, and certainly not incapable, because I made that amount as a legitimate professional, without help, without inheritance, and without shortcuts. And then I reminded them all that I worked in the same firm where Trayvon once claimed. I was in the mailroom, but that was 6 years ago, and I had climbed every floor of that building with discipline and sacrifice. And while my family mocked me and forgot me, I built something real and solid, and now I was going to use it to burn their lies down. And the judge looked at me and asked if that was true. Why did I live in a run-down apartment and drive a 2-decade-old car? And I looked straight at her and said, because I needed to know the truth about who my family was. I needed to strip myself of symbols of success to see what they would do. And when I told them I was struggling, they did not come to help me, they came to rob me. And that silence that followed was heavier than any courtroom pause I had ever heard. And I said, "Now that we know who I am, let us talk about who they are, starting with Trayvon." And I called him back to the stand. And this time there was no swagger, no performance. He walked with slow dread and sat down, looking anywhere but at me. And I pulled out folder number 2, thicker than the first, and began reading from it, showing the judge a certified copy of the tax lien filed by the IRS against T-Wash Global Enterprises for $150,000 in unpaid taxes. And when Trayvon tried to mumble about accounting errors, I presented his bankruptcy papers filed in the Northern District of Georgia, listing liabilities of nearly $500,000, and I held up a document showing that he owed over $400,000 to a Las Vegas casino, and asked him if those were the investors he mentioned in his earlier testimony. And Trayvon looked like he wanted the ground to open up and swallow him, but I kept going, asking him how he intended to manage a multi-million-dollar trust when he could not manage his own rent. And when he tried to deflect, I asked about the power of attorney he had been granted over our parents' joint investment account. And then I showed the records of 3 massive withdrawals totaling $420,000 in just 3 months, and the final one emptied the entire account. And when my father heard that number, he let out a shaky whisper, "Trayvon, tell me it is not true." And the look of betrayal on his face was unlike anything I had ever seen. And Trayvon began crying, not the composed tears of regret, but the loud, messy sobs of a man who knew the mask was gone. And I told the judge that what Trayvon had done was not just selfish, it was criminal, and moved to have his testimony stricken, and for the court to consider referring his actions to the district attorney for potential elder abuse and financial fraud. And Judge Holloway slammed her gavel and granted the motion, and ordered Trayvon to remain in the building and not leave, because now he was part of a potential criminal investigation. And as he returned to his seat, a hollow shell of the man who once mocked my frugality, my mother began to tremble, and I looked at her and said, "Now it is your turn, Patricia, please take the stand." And she walked slowly like she was being marched to the gallows, and she would not meet my eyes as she sat and clutched a silk handkerchief like it was a lifeline, and I asked her again if she loved me, and if everything she did was to protect me, and she nodded, saying, "Yes, I am your mother, Darius, and I love you, and I just want to help." And I opened folder number 3 and pulled out an email chain between her and a psychiatrist named Dr. Aries Thorne, and read her words aloud, where she asked him to diagnose me with paranoid schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, so they could have me committed and seize power of attorney, and promised to make it worth his while. And the gasp that went through the courtroom was not just shock, it was disgust. And when I read the doctor's response saying he would need documentation, and her reply saying she would take care of the documentation herself, the silence turned to revulsion. And I told the judge this was not protection, this was conspiracy, this was a mother trying to have her son locked in a mental institution just to access a bank account. And Patricia began sobbing, saying she did not mean it like that, and she was scared and desperate, and Trayvon said he would lose everything, and she had to choose. And I said, "You did choose, you chose him over me, you chose lies over truth." And I asked the judge if this was what love looked like, and reminded her that my mother was ready to destroy my life, not because I was unstable, but because I had money. And I looked back at Patricia and said, "You picked the wrong son, and you lost." And I closed the folder, but I was not done yet, because she had also testified about how much she loved Big Mama and how she wanted to protect her legacy. And I opened folder number 4 and pulled out a black USB and told the court that this was an audio recording from Big Mama's bedroom, taken 3 days before she died using a voice-activated device she kept on her nights and to dictate her journal. And I played the recording, and we all heard Big Mom, as voice weak but clear, saying how disappointed she was that Lawrence and Patricia had not visited in months, how they had spent her money on trips and credit cards, and how only I had been there feeding her, caring for her, and holding her hand when she cried. And I watched my mother collapse further into the witness chair, shaking her head and whispering no over and over. And I asked her if she still wanted to claim she loved Big Mama, or if she wanted to finally admit that she had abandoned her and now wanted to steal from her grandson. And I told the judge this was the truth, not a performance, not an illusion, and certainly not the delusion they tried to sell earlier. And the courtroom sat frozen, and the judge said nothing for a long moment, as if weighing the cost of the lies against the power of the truth. And I knew then that this was no longer a hearing, this was a reckoning. And I had brought receipts for every crime and every betrayal, and I still had folders left unopened. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights, and as Big Mom's voice faded from the speakers, the judge finally looked up, her expression unreadable, but her eyes locked on my mother, who now seemed to shrink with every breath, like the weight of her decisions were physically pressing down on her spine. And I stood still, letting the room absorb what it had just heard, not rushing, not gloating, just allowing the silence to speak louder than any argument. And then I turned slowly and retrieved folder number 5, the one I had saved for last, because it was not about fraud or theft or lies, it was about truth pure and raw. And it was the reason I had come here in the first place, the reason I had built my case and waited until the perfect moment, because inside that folder were the pages of Big Mom, as final journal, her handwriting still neat and graceful, even though her hands had started to tremble and her bones had begun to ache. And she wrote every word as if she knew they would be needed one day, as if she saw what was coming, and wanted to leave behind a weapon made of truth and memory and love. And I held up the journal and said, "Your Honor, these are Big Mama's words, written in her own hand, dated and signed and verified by a handwriting analyst who has already submitted an affidavit. And in these pages she explains exactly why she changed her will, why she cut out her daughter and son-in-law, why she left everything to me." And I read the first entry aloud, and her voice came alive in my own. She wrote, "Darius is the only one who shows up. He cooks, he cleans, he holds my hand when I cry. He does not ask for anything, he just loves me." And I am so ashamed of the other two. They only call when they want money. They tell me stories about cruises and new cars while I sit here alone, and I know when I am gone, they will fight him for the money, but I will not let them win. And as I read her pain-filled entries, the judge leaned closer, and Patricia wept openly, and Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, and I continued to read entry after entry describing how I stayed with her when her legs failed, how I bathed her and washed her sheets, how I massaged her feet, and sat by her bedside for hours reading scripture and her favorite poems, and how Patricia never returned her calls, and Lawrence forgot her birthday, and how Trayvon never even said thank you, and Ashley once told her she smelled old and asked to be picked up early from a visit, and with every word the courtroom darkened and the air grew heavier, because these were not accusations, they were memories from a dying woman, and I knew no amount of legal maneuvering could undo the truth of a grandmother's love and the bitterness of her abandonment. And when I finally closed the journal, I looked directly at the judge and said, "Everything you have seen today is just the surface, but this is the core, this is the truth, and you can see it in her words and in their faces and in the fact that they had to lie and steal and manipulate to get to this courtroom, while I just had to tell the truth." And I stepped back, and the judge asked if the journal had been submitted into evidence, and I said yes, and the clerk confirmed its entry, and then the judge leaned forward and asked Sterling if he had any response, and Sterling, who had been silent for nearly 30 minutes, stood slowly like a man rising from wreckage, and he cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I withdraw the petition," and the words hit the room like a sudden thunderclap, and Trayvon stood up shouting, "What?" and Ashley grabbed his arm trying to calm him down, and Patricia collapsed against Lawrence, who just stared ahead blankly, and Sterling continued, "We had no idea of Mr. Washington's credentials or the evidence he would present, and after reviewing the documents, I believe this case has no merit." And the judge nodded slowly and looked down at her desk, tapping her pen 3 times before saying, "Motion to dismiss is granted with prejudice, and the trust shall remain in the sole control of Mr. Darius Washington." And the courtroom burst into hushed murmurs, and I stood there unmoved, not smiling, not gloating, just breathing deeply as if finally inhaling clean air after years in a burning house. And the judge raised her hand, silencing the room, and then said, "One more thing, Mr. Washington. This court commends you not just for your legal expertise, but for your patience, your restraint, and your devotion to your grandmother, and I hope you use this inheritance not as a weapon, but as a foundation." And I said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and meant it, because I knew this money was never about luxury or pride. It was about legacy and justice and freedom. And when the judge rose and exited the bench, the bailiff called adjourned, and the courtroom emptied slowly like the aftermath of a storm, and I remained seated watching as my family gathered their things, Trayvon glaring, but defeated, Ashley wiping her cheeks, Patricia still sobbing, and Lawrence walking like his body was made of glass. And as they passed me, Trayvon paused and said, "This is not over." And I said, "For you maybe." And Ashley said, "You think you are better than us now?" And I said, "No, I just think I am finally free." And Patricia whispered, "I loved you." And I said, "You loved the idea of me until I grew into something real." And Lawrence said, "You think you won." And I said, "I think I survived, and I think that is enough." And then they left, and I was alone in the courtroom, the folders still on the table, the journal still in my hand. And I stood there remembering every moment that brought me here, every insult, every dismissal, every lie, and how it had all led to this quiet moment of victory, not loud or explosive, but deep and unshakable. And as I walked outside, the sunlight was bright, and I breathed it in and stepped toward my car, still old, still dented, but now mine in every way. And I sat inside and closed the door and stared at the steering wheel. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not because I was sad, but because the weight had finally lifted, and I knew that Big Mama would have been proud, not just because I won, but because I did it without becoming like them. And I did it with truth and silence and strategy and love. And I drove away from that courthouse, not looking back, because the past had been buried and the future was waiting, and I had work to do, not just with the trust or the money, but with healing, because winning does not erase the scars. It just gives you the peace to finally tend to them, and I would use that money to build Something real, a scholarship fund in Big Mama's name, a care center for elders, a nonprofit that helped people like me, who had no one but still chose to rise, and I would never forget what it felt like to sit in that courtroom alone, but powerful, and I would never again question my worth or my mind or my strength, because I had proven it to the world, and more importantly to myself. When I got home from court that afternoon, the house felt different, not in a way I could touch, but in the way a deep breath feels different when the air is clean. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, taking in the silence that used to suffocate me, but now felt peaceful, and I walked through the hallway past the framed photos of Big Mama, her smile frozen in time, her strength still echoing in the air, and I whispered I did it like she could hear me, and maybe she could, because that whole house felt like her warmth, her fight, her truth, and I sat down in the old armchair she loved and opened her journal again, reading it not for evidence this time, but for comfort and wisdom, because her words were no longer a tool for war. They were medicine, and I needed healing. And as I turned the pages, I realized that this journey had broken something in me, but not in a bad way. It had broken the part of me that needed validation from people who never truly saw me, and it had shattered the illusions I held onto about family, loyalty, and love. And in its place, it left something stronger, something cleaner, a foundation built on clarity and survival. And after reading for nearly an hour, I stood up and walked into the spare bedroom, the one that had been gathering dust, and turned it into a plan, a blueprint of what I was going to build, not with just the money, but with the truth. And I began writing letters, first to my law firm, thanking them for their support and discretion, and requesting a 6-month leave of absence to focus on personal restoration, and then to a local community center about starting a legal aid program in Big Mama's name, and then to a nonprofit that helped elder care victims, offering to fund new investigation teams to help people who had no family or worse, family preyed on them. And I wrote a letter to my former landlord, thanking him for never raising the rent and for never asking questions, and including a check to cover the next 2 years of rent for the next tenant who might need a break. And then I wrote a letter to myself, and it started with, I forgive you for staying silent all those years. I forgive you for doubting your strength and for believing the lies, and I forgive you for loving people who did not know how to love you back. And I signed it with my full name, Darius Emmanuel Washington. And the moment I wrote that signature, I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot untied, and I folded the letter and placed it in Big Mama's Bible. Then I closed the door to the spare room and went into the kitchen and cooked her favorite meal, baked mac and cheese, collard greens, sweet potatoes, and cornbread. And I sat at the table and made a plate for her too, just like I used to, and I talked to her about everything, and thanked her for trusting me, and promised her that I would never let her legacy be twisted by greed or guilt. And I cried again, but this time the tears were warm, not bitter. And the next morning I woke up early and went for a walk through the neighborhood. The same streets I had once felt ashamed to walk now felt like sacred ground. Every corner, every crack in the pavement held a memory of struggle, and every porch held stories of resilience. And as I walked, I saw Miss Carolyn watering her plants, and she waved and said she heard about what happened in court and that Big Mama would be proud. And I smiled and told her thank you, and that meant more to me than anything. And I walked past the park where I used to sit as a kid, dreaming of being seen, of being heard. And now I had found my voice, and I would never let anyone silence it again. And when I got back home, I checked my phone and saw over 50 missed calls from family, most of them from Trayvon and Ashley, and even a few from distant cousins who had ignored me for years and now wanted to talk. But I did not return the calls. I was not angry, just done. And instead I opened my email and began building something real, the Darius Washington Foundation, focused on elder protection and legal education. And I bought the domain, registered the nonprofit, and started drafting the mission statement. And every word felt like a step forward, like laying bricks for a road no one could tear down. And I hired an accountant and a lawyer, not because I needed them, but because I wanted everything done right, clean, honest, and with integrity. And I went down to the courthouse the next week, not for another trial, but to file a petition to have the trust restructured with an oversight committee to make sure no future family member could ever manipulate it again, and the clerk looked surprised and asked why I was doing it, and I said because power without accountability turns into poison, and she smiled and stamped the papers and said good man, and I walked out into the sunlight. Feeling lighter and stronger, and a few days later, I got a letter in the mail from Patricia, not an email, not a text, but a handwritten letter in blue ink on floral stationery, and she said she was sorry, and that she had failed me, and that she did not expect forgiveness, but wanted to at least explain that fear drove her, and that Trayvon was always the loud one, the demanding one, and she just followed him because it was easier, and I read every word, and felt the pain behind them. And I put the letter in a drawer and left it there, not because I did not care, but because I was not ready, and healing does not happen in one letter. And I received a voicemail from Ashley crying, saying she did not know it had gone that far and that she never meant to hurt me. And I listened and then deleted it because regret is not the same as change. And I got an email from Trayvon, long and full of excuses and veiled threats and apologies wrapped in pride. And I archived it without reading past the first paragraph because some bridges are not meant to be repaired, and I focused on the foundation, on the scholarship applications that started pouring in, on the letters from seniors thanking me for resources, on the local newspaper article that called me a quiet hero, and on the mural that went up at the community center of Big Mama, sitting in her chair smiling with light shining around her. And I stood in front of that mural the day it was unveiled, and I wept in front of everyone because that was her real legacy, not the money, not the house, but the love and the fight and the grace she carried through everything. And I spent the next 6 months rebuilding not just the house, which I renovated room by room, but my own spirit, and I planted a garden in the backyard and invited neighborhood kids to help, and we talked about law and history and cooking and truth, and I felt more alive in those afternoons than I had in any courtroom. And one evening I stood in that backyard looking at the stars, and I felt something settle in me, something final, not an end but a peace, and I knew that no matter what happened next, I had done right by her and by myself, and that was the only victory that mattered. When the morning sun lit up my room the day after filing those final papers, I felt like I had woken up in a new life. Even though nothing had physically changed in the apartment, the air felt cleaner, the silence no longer screamed, and for the first time in years, I didn't reach for my phone with dread and fear of missed threats or guilt-soaked messages. Instead, I took my time getting dressed, fixing myself breakfast like Big Mama used to on slow Sundays, and after I ate, I sat at the little desk in the corner of my room, the one that overlooked the narrow alley, and opened my laptop, not to look for jobs or read news, but to start writing the speech I knew I would have to give soon, because word had gotten out in the community about what I did in court, and requests for interviews, talks, and panels started coming in. And though I wasn't seeking attention, I understood the responsibility of what I carried and how many people needed someone who spoke not from theory, but from lived pain. And I wanted my words to matter, to resonate, not just for applause, but for healing. So I began typing, remembering the faces of the women at Big Mama's church who had whispered to me about stolen pensions, caretakers who mistreated them, and the men who sat on porches with their backs bent from a lifetime of labor only to be treated like burdens when they couldn't work anymore. And I wrote with all of them in my mind, pouring truth into every sentence. And as the speech formed, I found myself drifting back to memories of Trayvon and Ashley, not because I missed them, but because I wanted to understand where things broke. And I realized it wasn't one moment, but a slow erosion of trust over years, ignored hurts, hidden envy, quiet betrayals. And when I looked back at the courtroom moment where they rolled their eyes at me, I saw it clearly, not as personal hatred, but as their inability to see me outside the role they had cast for me, which was the quiet, forgiving one, the one who never pushed back. And when I broke that mold, they reacted not with curiosity, but with contempt, because some people would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong. And I knew now that I could not make them see what they refused to acknowledge, and that freed me. So I went on to finish the speech and sent it to the community center director, who called me back within minutes with tears in her voice, saying it was exactly what people needed to hear, and she invited me to deliver it at the annual Truth and Justice Gathering, which was being held that year at the park, where Big Mama used to organize food drives, and I accepted, and then sat back in my chair, breathing in deep the weight of it all settling on me. Not as a burden, but as armor, and over the next few days I kept to myself, mostly working on foundation, logistics, confirming the grant disbursement timeline, and coordinating with legal volunteers who had started signing up from across the city, and each person I spoke to brought more fuel to my resolve, like the 20-year-old law student who said she became interested in elder justice after watching her grandmother be manipulated by a relative, and the 62-year-old retired social worker who wanted to give her time and wisdom freely, and I saw in them what I had once lost hope in: good people fighting quiet wars, and I knew I had found my tribe. And then came the day of the speech, a warm, breezy Saturday with soft clouds moving slowly across a wide sky. And I arrived early, wearing one of Big Mama's brooches on my jacket, and carrying her Bible tucked under my arm, not for religion, but for remembrance. And as people gathered on benches and picnic blankets, I took a moment to stand beneath the oak tree where she once read stories to neighborhood kids, and I placed a small flower at its base, whispering thank you. And when the director called my name, I walked onto the small wooden platform, heart steady, voice ready, and I spoke not as a lawyer or a victim, but as a witness to both betrayal and redemption. And I told them about silence and how dangerous it is when we let it cover injustice. I told them about family and how blood alone does not make someone worthy of your trust. I told them about the courtroom and how the truth can shake even the most prepared liars. And I ended by saying that justice is not a moment, it is a choice made every day in how we treat each other, especially those who have no voice. And when I finished, there was no applause at first, just a deep, collective silence, like the crowd had inhaled something heavy and real. And when they finally clapped, it wasn't loud, but full of something deeper: respect, understanding, maybe even shared grief. And afterward, people came up to me, hugging, thanking, crying. And I stayed until sunset, talking, listening, letting the community know I was not above them, I was them. And I returned home exhausted but whole, and over the next few weeks the foundation grew faster than I expected, with donations coming in from people I didn't know, letters arriving from elders sharing their stories, and requests from schools to speak about legal awareness, and I said yes to every opportunity, not out of ego but purpose. And one night, as I sat reviewing applications, I got an email from a woman named Lydia, who said she had known Big Mama from church and wanted to share something in person. So we met at a small cafe near the old community garden, and she handed me an envelope with trembling hands, saying Big Mama had once helped her escape an abusive caregiver and never spoke of it to protect her, and she wanted me to have the thank you letter she had written years ago but never sent. And when I opened it later at home, I saw how much quiet good Big Mama had done in the shadows, and it strengthened my resolve to never let her name be dragged through mud again. And I had the letter framed and placed in the foundation office right above my desk, where it would always remind me why I started this journey. And around that time I also received a formal notice that Patricia had dropped her claim to the estate, entirely citing emotional exhaustion and personal reflection. And while I did not respond, I did feel something in me soften, not toward her actions, but toward the version of her who once loved me, the one who braided my hair and packed my school lunches. And while that version was gone, maybe forever, I still honored her by not hating her, and that small mercy was for me, not her. And Ashley reached out again, this time asking to meet in person. And after much thought, I agreed, but set the meeting in a public place and kept it short. And when she arrived, she looked different, older, more tired, and she said she was sorry, not for what she did, but for not stopping it. And I told her I believed she meant it, but I also told her that healing would take more than words, and she nodded and left, and I didn't chase her. And that night I slept deeply without dreams, and woke up knowing I had crossed a line into a new chapter, one where pain was not gone but understood. And I continued working, building, living not as a survivor of betrayal, but as a steward of legacy. And though I never heard from Trayvon again, I no longer needed to, because some silences are answers. And in those quiet days, as the foundation found its rhythm, and the city began to speak my name with respect, I felt Big Mama everywhere, in the laughter of children at the after-school program, in the firm handshakes of donors, in the quiet determination of elders walking through our doors seeking help. And I knew I had not just won a case, I had reclaimed a story, and I was ready to keep telling it until my last breath. My father's lips were trembling as he stared at Trayvon with a mixture of disbelief and dread. His voice, cracked and small, said, "Tell me, it is not true. Tell me you did not steal our retirement." Trayvon blinked quickly, his eyes red and shining, as if he was searching for an excuse that did not exist. And then he broke down into a flood of tears, not quiet, dignified tears, but the loud, messy sobs of a child who had been caught doing something unforgivable. His voice came out in hiccups. "I was going to pay it back. It was a sure thing. I just needed more time. Once the market came back, I would have returned it all with interest. I did it for you, Dad. I wanted to help you. You stole $420,000 from the very people who protected you, fed you, loved you, raised you." I said every word like a hammer blow, and when their accounts were empty, you did not stop. You looked around for the next pot of gold, and you saw mine. You saw my trust fund and decided I would be your next victim. You filed for conservatorship, not because you thought I was unwell, but because your scam had dried up and you needed a new source to bleed from. The courtroom fell into silence so thick it felt like it might crush us all. The judge's eyes narrowed, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of her gavel. I turned to her. "Your Honor, I request that the witness be impeached and all his statements stricken from the record. I also strongly urge that the prosecution consider these documents possible charges of grand larceny and elder abuse." She nodded slowly. "Motion granted," she said, and brought the gavel down with a crash that echoed through every corner of the room. Trayvon stumbled off the witness stand, his legs barely holding him up. He did not look at me. He did not look at our parent. He collapsed into the chair beside Ashley, who now sat in stunned silence, her face pale, her hand pressed against her mouth. My parents were still as statues, frozen. In the moment they realized everything had turned to ash around them. They came into this courtroom with confidence, believing they would walk away with everything I owned. They expected to see me crushed and silent, begging for mercy. But instead they watched their golden sun exposed. They watched their carefully built lies crumble with every piece of evidence I presented. And now here they sat with nothing, no words, no dignity, just a mountain of regret and a silence that burned. I looked at them, and they looked older suddenly, not just physically, but spiritually, like the burden of what they had done had aged their souls. Lawrence Washington, who used to preach with booming certainty, looked like a man who could no longer hear his own voice. Patricia, whose pride once filled every room she entered, sat slumped and trembling, her hands clutching her lap like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. It was not enough. I could feel that there was more to uncover, more rot to drag into the light. "Your Honor," I said, "I would like to submit another piece of evidence, this time related to the financial motive behind the petition." "Granted," the judge replied, her tone sharp and steady. I approached the bench and handed over another folder. Inside was a printout of an email exchange between Patricia and a man named Dr. Thorne. First email from my mother read, "Dr. Thorne, we have a situation. Darius has inherited everything. We need to contest this. If we can prove he is mentally incompetent, we can get power of attorney. Can you write a report saying he suffers from paranoid schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder? We will make it worth your while." Gasps erupted around the room. Several people in the gallery recoiled in disgust. A mother asking a doctor to falsify a mental health diagnosis for her own son. Patricia turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to explain, but could not find the words that would not make it worse. "That is not what it sounds like," she stammered. "I was worried about you, Darius. You were acting strange. I just wanted a professional opinion. A professional opinion," I repeated, "or a paid diagnosis, because here is Dr. Thorne's reply. Patricia, I can write the report, but I need to see him first, or at least have documentation of erratic behavior. Your response: I will handle the documentation. Just get the paperwork ready for the involuntary commitment hearing. Once he is in the facility, we can access the accounts." The judge's knuckles turned white around her gavel. "Involuntary commitment," I said, my voice low and hard like the edge of a blade. "You were not trying to help me, Mom. You were planning to have me dragged from my apartment, locked up in a padded room, drugged until I could not speak. And also you and Trayvon could steal what Big Mama left me." Patricia was crying now. Not the elegant weeping she had shown before, but the kind of desperate sobbing that stripped away every mask. I did not mean it like that. She said over and over, I was scared. Trayvon said he needed the money. He was going to lose everything. I did not know what to do. I had to make a choice. You had. Choose, I repeated, and you chose him, the one who lied and stole and ruined everything. You chose his crisis over my sanity. You chose a fraud over your own son. The courtroom was frozen except for the sound of Patricia's crying, and the judge who was staring down at her with eyes that could have melted. Still, I turned to the bench again. Your Honor, this is not just a family argument. This is a calculated attempt to manipulate the legal system, to rob an innocent man of his freedom and identity for financial gain. She nodded again, slowly, silently, and I could feel the tide continuing to turn. Patricia looked at me, pleading. Darius, please, I am sorry. I was not thinking clearly. I was desperate. You were thinking very clearly. I said every decision you made was deliberate. You knew what you were doing, and you knew who you were hurting, and now you have to live with it. The silence returned, but now it was darker, heavier, and full of consequence. I was not finished. I turned back to the folder and pulled out one last item. This one was small, but it carried the most weight. It was a tiny black USB drive, and I held it up. Your Honor, I said I would like to play Exhibit D, an audio file taken from Big Mama's bedroom 3 days before she passed away. She had kept a voice recorder by her bed to dictate her thoughts. I loaded the file onto the courtroom laptop and hit play. The room filled with her voice, fragile, but sharp as ever, talking to herself about the things she saw and felt. I miss my Darius. He is the only one who checks on me. Patricia only comes when she wants something. Lawrence pretends he cannot hear me. Trayvon brings strangers to my room at night. I do not feel safe here. I want Darius to have everything. He is the only one who cares. I want him to know I love him always. The audio ended, and for a few moments no one moved, no one breathed. The judge leaned back in her chair and stared at Patricia with eyes full of disgust. The damage was complete. My parents looked like ghosts, pale, hollow, lost, and Trayvon sat hunched in the corner staring at the floor while Ashley wiped tears from her cheeks. I looked around the room and felt a shift. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The moment I stepped outside the courtroom during the recess, I was followed by a quiet hush, as if the entire hallway were holding its breath. The reporters who had been buzzing earlier were now frozen, their cameras lowered, unsure whether they were allowed to look at me, like they had seen a ghost. Return from battle, my heels echoed on the cold floor as I walked past faces I had known since childhood, faces that now held guilt, shame, and disbelief. Some were from the church, some were from the old neighborhood people who used to smile when my parents spoke, used to nod and clap and agree with every word from the pulpit. Now they looked at me as if they were waking up from a long dream and had just realized the house they thought was built on faith was really built on secrets. I passed Sister Coleman, who used to lead Sunday school. Her hand went to her chest, and she whispered, Lord have mercy, and I did not stop walking. I passed Brother Reese, who used to cut our lawn. He could not meet my eye. I passed Mrs. Dillard, who taught me how to bake when I was 9. She had tears in her eyes, and she said, Darius, baby, I am so sorry. I should have seen it. I did not stop for any of them, because I was afraid if I did the weight of what I had just done would crush me, so I kept walking and went outside. The air was sharp and cold, and it bit through my suit and hit my skin like needles. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes, trying to catch my breath, trying to feel the ground beneath me, because everything still felt like it was floating, like I was not really here. I opened my eyes and looked up at the sky, gray and low and heavy. It matched everything inside me. The door behind me opened, and I turned, half expecting to see one of the reporters, but it was the judge. She had taken off her robe and now stood in a plain black dress that made her seem smaller, more human. She walked up beside me and said, You did well in there. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weight in it. I nodded, but I could not speak yet. She leaned on the railing beside me and looked out at the street below. You know, she said, when I was your age, I had to testify against my uncle. He touched my sister for years, and no one believed her until I took the stand. It tore my family in half. But sometimes the truth has to burn before anything new can grow. I looked at her, surprised not just by what she said, but by the fact that she shared it with me. Thank you, I said finally. Thank you for believing me. I did not believe you, she said. Not at first. I believed the evidence you brought. and the way you spoke with conviction, but belief that came after watching your family fall apart, and you still stood up anyway, that is what made me believe you. I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded, and she gave me a small nod back before walking away and leaving me in the cold again. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, just breathing, trying to let everything settle, then I went back inside and walked straight the bathroom. I locked the door, leaned on the sink, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked like someone who had run a marathon. My eyes were blood shot, my suit was wrinkled, my hands were shaking. I splashed water on my face and whispered, "You are almost there, just hold on a little longer." When I returned to the courtroom, the mood had shifted. The gallery was full again, but now it was quieter, more respectful, like the people inside understood they were witnessing the fall of something big. The judge had put her robe back on, and the bailiff called order. As I returned to my seat, Ashley sat next to me, eyes swollen from crying, but she did not say anything, just reached over and touched my hand, and I let her for a moment, because even after everything, some part of me remembered the girl who used to bring me coffee at work, who used to laugh at my jokes, who used to care. I pulled my hand away gently when the bailiff brought in my parents again. The silence deepened. Lawrence walked slower than before, like his shoes were too heavy. Patricia followed close behind, still wiping her nose. Trayvon had not come back yet, and I wondered if he would come back at all. The judge looked over the room and said, "We will now resume proceedings. Darius, please take the stand again." I walked up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and sat in the witness chair. The judge said earlier, "You submitted documents, audio and written testimony, proving intent to defraud with multiple counts of perjury and medical conspiracy. I am now giving you a chance to say anything else you want before I deliver my ruling." I nodded and took a deep breath. I looked at my parents, not with hatred, but with something deeper, sadness. I said, "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed quiet enough, if I made enough money, maybe you would finally be proud of me. Maybe you would see me as more than just a tool for your image or a bank account to withdraw from. But now I realize that no amount of success was ever going to be enough for you, because you never wanted me to succeed. You wanted me to stay beneath you, controllable, moldable, profitable." I paused and let that sink in. "You taught me to believe in God and family and community. And I still do, but I believe in the kind of God who does not need to be feared, in the kind of family that lifts each other up, and in a community that protects its most vulnerable, not exploits them." "You failed me," I said, "and your punishment is not jail or a fine. Your punishment is that you have to live with the fact that I survived you, that everything you tried to destroy in me only made me stronger." I turned to the judge. "I am done." She nodded and looked over the courtroom, then said, "I will return in 20 minutes with my ruling." And she stood up and walked out. The room was silent again until the door clicked shut. Then people began whispering, reporters scribbling, everyone buzzing, and I sat back down and waited. Ashley leaned in and said, "I am sorry, Darius. I believed them. I really thought you were spiraling. I did not know they were lying." I looked at her and said, "I know," and she nodded. Like that was the only answer that made sense. Patricia turned around from the front row and said quietly, "Darius, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I was scared." I nodded slowly and said, "I know, and that is the saddest part, because you still did." The door opened again, and the judge returned. The bailiff called, "All rise," and everyone stood. She walked to the bench, sat down, and looked directly at me, and then at my parents. "I have reviewed the evidence and testimony," she said, "and I find that the petition for conservatorship was based on fraudulent claims. The court finds no evidence of mental incompetence or instability on the part of Darius Williams. All documents submitted by the petitioners were forged, manipulated, or obtained under unethical pretenses. Furthermore, I am referring this case to the district attorney for investigation into potential charges of financial abuse, fraud, and attempted involuntary commitment based on falsified diagnoses. Lawrence Patricia Trayvon, if found guilty, you could face up to 10 years in prison and restitution for the stolen funds. I also issue a permanent restraining order, effective immediately. You are to have no contact with Darius Williams in person or via any medium. This court is adjourned." She banged her gavel, and just like that, it was over. As the courtroom slowly emptied, I sat in my seat, frozen not because I could not move, but because I did not yet know how to return to a world that looked the same, but would never be the same again. The gavel had come down, the judgment had been read, and yet I still felt like something inside me had not caught up with the moment. I stared ahead at the judge's bench, trying to memorize every detail of the wood grain, the way the flag hung behind her chair, the quiet rustle of people rising from the pews. All of it seemed distant, like I was watching through glass. Then I stood slowly and walked outside. Ashley followed silently for a few steps before stopping near the door. She said nothing, but I could feel her gaze behind me, heavy, uncertain, maybe ashamed. I did not look back. I stepped into the hallway and saw a line of reporters standing behind the velvet ropes, their cameras off for once, their eyes studying me instead of recording me. They looked confused, like they did not know how to tell this story without making someone into a villain. But I had not come here to be a villain or a hero. I had come to tell the truth, and the truth did not need a headline. I walked past them toward the elevator and pressed the button. It opened with a chime, and I stepped inside alone, letting the doors shut me away from the stairs, the whispers, the noise. The ride down was silent and slow, and when the doors opened again, I was back on the ground floor, the place where I had first entered this building. Feeling small, outnumbered, and afraid now, I stepped out with the same body but a completely different weight on my shoulders, and as I crossed the lobby, I saw two familiar faces waiting for me, Danielle and Thomas, standing together, both with tired eyes and proud smiles. They rushed to me and hugged me tightly, and I felt something in my chest crack open and release all the tension that had built up since the beginning of this fight. Thomas said, "You did it, man. I knew you would." And Danielle just said, "I am so sorry you ever had to," and I nodded, hugging them both back. I wanted to cry, but the tears would not come, not yet, not until later. They walked me outside where the cold hit my face again, and I breathed it in fully for the first time that day, like it was cleansing me from the inside out. The sun had broken through the clouds, now casting long shadows across the sidewalk and making everything feel just a little bit more real. We stood there for a few moments watching the people come and go, nobody stopping us, nobody asking for interviews. We were just three people standing together in quiet victory. Thomas asked, "What now?" and I said, "I do not know, but I think I am finally ready to figure that out." We went to a nearby cafe where the booths were old and the coffee was cheap, but it was warm and quiet, and that was all we needed. We ordered and sat in a booth near the window, watching the city move outside, as if it had not just witnessed something life-altering. Danielle pulled out her phone and showed me the articles already being posted, headlines flooding in, some accurate, some exaggerated. But the truth was out there now, and it was no longer trapped in my chest. It belonged to the world, and the world would have to decide what to do with it. I read one that said local preacher accused of fraud by son in dramatic courtroom reversal. Another said former Golden family exposed in conservatorship scheme. But the one that hit me hardest was the one that said survivor speaks out and changes everything. That one made me close my eyes for a second and breathe deeply, because it reminded me I had survived more than just a court battle. I had survived betrayal, manipulation, psychological warfare, and the crushing weight of being silenced for years. Thomas leaned forward and asked, "You want to go home?" And I said, "I am not sure where home is anymore." And he said, "Then we will find it together." Danielle said, "You always have a home with us," and I nodded, knowing it was true, even if I did not know what it meant. Yet we finished our coffee in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, and when we stepped back outside, the air felt warmer, like the storm had passed, and something new was beginning. We walked down the block, not speaking, just walking, and I let the city wrap around me with all its noise and chaos and indifference, and I realized that maybe healing did not come with a bang or a tearful break. And maybe it came quietly in the spaces between moments, in the way you chose to keep walking when you had every reason to stop. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment for the first time alone since the trial had ended. The walls were still the same, the furniture untouched, but everything felt different. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled down the old photo albums my mother had made when I was a child. I flipped through them slowly, seeing images of birthdays, holidays, vacations, and smiles. But now those smiles felt heavier, like masks or performances, and I wondered how many times I had smiled like that to survive, to stay useful. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. Then I opened my laptop and typed a message to my lawyer thanking her for her relentless work. Then I opened a blank document and began to write not a statement, not a blog post, just a letter to myself, a reminder that I had done something hard, something necessary, and that I was still standing. When I finished, I saved it as day one and closed the lid. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, not afraid, just still, letting the silence settle into my bones. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Trayvon. It said, "I am sorry. I did not know how to face you. I thought they were right." I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back, "I know, and I hope you find your way too, because I cannot carry you anymore." I turned the phone off and placed it face down. Then I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling until sleep came slowly, softly, without resistance. And in the quiet moments before I drifted off, I thought about all the people who had doubted me, all the people who had stayed silent, all the people who had turned their backs, and I realized they were not my burden anymore. I had carried them long enough. Tomorrow I would wake up and begin again, not because I had to, but because I could. The morning after everything changed, I sat alone in my room, surrounded by the kind of silence that is both peaceful and heavy at the same time. I had slept better than I had in months, but now that the adrenaline had faded, the weight of everything that had happened came crashing back down, and I realized how exhausted I truly was. The legal battle had ended, but that did not mean the damage had been erased, and while the judge's ruling gave me justice on paper, the emotional wounds still pulsed underneath every thought. I moved slowly through the apartment, like I was learning to live in it again, opening the windows to let light in, making coffee just to have something warm to hold. I stood by the window watching the street outside the city, moving as if nothing monumental had happened yesterday, as if my life had not just been put on display, dissected and debated in front of strangers. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the world keeps turning no matter what you go through, and the real victory is choosing to keep moving with it. I checked my phone again, a dozen unread messages, some from news outlets, others from people I had not heard from in years, and one from my Aunt Clara. She had been the only member of the family who sent a message of support during the trial. It was short but powerful. "I believe you and I am proud of you." I responded simply, "Thank you, and I hope we talk soon." After finishing my coffee, I got dressed in a hoodie and jeans and stepped out into the city, the cold air waking me up as I walked down the sidewalk, unsure of where I was going. I ended up outside the church where my parents had spent so many Sundays, preaching about love and truth, while hiding cruelty and manipulation behind polished smiles. The building stood tall, its doors open as always, but I did not go in. I simply looked at it from across the street, remembering how many times I had sat inside its walls, trying to make sense of why I felt so small, so broken, even when I did everything right. I turned away and kept walking past blocks filled with memories, some good, some sharp and painful, until I reached the park where I used to take walks when I needed to think. It was quieter now, a few people scattered across benches, lost in their own worlds. I sat on the same bench I had sat on after I first met the lawyer who would later become my advocate and friend. I remembered our first conversation, her telling me we would face resistance, that the truth would not be enough without courage. And I remembered telling her I had both. Now I believed it. We sat there for nearly an hour, not saying much, and yet everything felt like it was shifting inside me. For the first time in years, I was not living on someone else's terms, not holding back to make others comfortable, not hiding my truth to protect people who had never protected me. I stood up from that bench and walked back home, each step feeling steadier than the last. When I got home, I opened my laptop again and found the draft I had saved the night before, titled Day One. I added more to it, thoughts about healing, about forgiveness, about what it means to start over when your past has been weaponized against you. I wrote about pain, but also about power, about how surviving is not weakness but proof that you are stronger than what tried to break you. Then I saved it again, and for the first time I hit print, holding the pages in my hand like something tangible to prove I had reclaimed my voice. I slid them into a folder and placed it on my desk. Maybe I would never show them to anyone, maybe they were just for me, but they existed. And that mattered. Around noon my phone rang. It was Trayvon. I stared at his name for a moment, unsure whether to answer, but then I picked up and said hello. He sounded nervous, hesitant, like someone trying to find the right words after years of silence. He said, "I messed up. I believed what they told me. I thought you were just angry and selfish, and I did not want to believe they could be wrong. I listened quietly, not ready to make it easy for him. He said I was wrong, and I know saying sorry does not fix it, but I am sorry, and I hope one day you can forgive me. I said maybe one day, but not today, and I meant it not out of anger, but because healing takes boundaries, and I was finally learning to protect mine. He said I understand, and then he hung up. No promises, no fake closings, just a quiet end to a broken bond that might never fully repair, and that was okay. I spent the rest of the day doing small things, cleaning my apartment, organizing shelves, tossing out things I had held onto for too long. It felt like I was shedding the last remnants of who I had to be just to survive. I even found an old photo of my younger self tucked inside a book, a kid with bright eyes and a fake smile wearing a sweater my mother had picked out for me. I looked at that photo for a long time, then placed it on my desk next to the folder labeled Day 1 as a reminder of how far I had come that evening. Danielle and Thomas stopped by unannounced, carrying takeout and a six-pack of soda. They said we thought you could use some company, and I let them in, grateful even if I did not say it out loud. We sat on the floor around the coffee table, eating and laughing, and not once did we talk about the trial or the church or my parents. We just existed in the moment, three people who had been through hell and come out. On the other side, they told me about their plans to move into a new apartment and asked if I wanted to help paint. I said yes without hesitation, and it felt good to say yes to something without fear or guilt. After they left, I cleaned up the wrappers and bottles, then stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky below. My breath fogged the glass, and I traced a small circle with my finger, just to feel something. I thought about the next steps, therapy maybe, or speaking publicly, or just getting back to school or work. I did not know yet, and for once not knowing did not scare me. It excited me because I knew whatever came next would be on my terms. I had faced the courtroom, the cameras, the crushing pressure of telling a story no one wanted to believe, and I had done it with nothing but truth and resolve. I had watched my parents roll their eyes in mockery and still walked with my head held high, and now it was over, not perfectly, not cleanly, but over enough for me to breathe again. I went to bed that night without checking the news, without reading comments or emails. I turned off the lights and lay down in the quiet, knowing that the world would still be there tomorrow. But for now I had given myself something no one else ever could: peace. The days that followed felt like moving through the echo of a storm, one where the thunder had stopped, but the air still trembled from everything it had carried. I woke up each morning not in panic, but in the unfamiliar quiet that came after surviving something you thought might destroy you. I no longer braced for attacks from my parents, no longer feared what the next courtroom hearing would bring. Instead, I was faced with something equally intimidating: freedom. Not just physical freedom, but the kind that makes you responsible for what happens next. I made a list on a scrap of paper, things I needed to do, people I might forgive, places I might visit again, and as I stared at the list I realized I did not know where to begin. I spent one whole morning cleaning my apartment from top to bottom, not because it was dirty, but because I needed to reclaim every inch of space, every corner that had once felt like a holding cell for my fear. I opened the windows, let the sunlight in, rearranged the books on my shelf, even threw out the old picture frames I had been too afraid to touch before. By the time I was done, it felt like a new home, and maybe that was the first step. I called my lawyer and thanked her again, not just for fighting beside me, but for believing in me when I was barely holding myself together. She told me she was proud of me, and that meant more than I could say. Then she said something I would never forget: "You are not what they did to you, you are what you chose to do next." I held onto that like a lifeline. Over the next few days, I went for walks through the city, not to go anywhere in particular, just to feel the rhythm of life again. I stopped by the coffee shop near the courthouse where everything had once felt suffocating and ordered a hot drink. The barrister recognized me from the news and gave it to me for free with a quiet nod. I took my cup and sat by the window watching people pass, and for the first time I felt like one of them, not a headline, not a victim, just a person. I bumped into an old classmate from university who had read about the case. She looked surprised to see me walking around like I was okay, and she said I would not have been strong enough to do what you did. I smiled, and said you never know how strong you are until you have no choice later that evening. I got a message from my cousin Lee, someone who had always been quiet at family gathering, someone who had never once spoken up during the chaos. She wrote, "I am sorry for not doing more. I saw what was happening, but I was too scared to say anything. I hope you can forgive me. And I want to be better." I did not respond right away, but I read her message 3 times and saved it. Maybe some bridges can be rebuilt, not now, but someday. The news cycle moved on quickly, like it always does. New scandals, new controversies. And soon my story was no longer the top headline. But I did not mind. The silence was a gift I had earned. I used it to start writing again, not just for myself, but for others who might be standing where I once stood. I wrote blog posts under a pseudonym, stories about truth, justice, healing. And the long road back from betrayal, the response was more than I expected. People from different cities, different countries sending messages saying thank you for saying what I could not, and that made every word worth it. I reconnected with old friends who had distanced themselves when things got hard. Some apologized sincerely, others just wanted to pretend nothing had ever happened. I chose carefully who I let back in, not out of bitterness, but because I had learned the hard way that not everyone deserves a second chance. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma. At first, I was nervous, not because of the pain, but because I did not know how to live without it. It had been a part of me for so long, but slowly I began to unravel the layers, to name things that once held power over me, and to replace shame with clarity. I learned that healing was not a straight line, but a spiral, and some days I would feel like I was back at the beginning, and that was okay. I joined a support group once a week, a circle of people who knew the language of survival. Without having to explain it, we sat in a dim room with folding chairs and plastic cups of water, and shared pieces of ourselves without judgment. I spoke for the first time in week 3, and cried before I finished my second sentence, but no one looked away, no one flinched, and that moment felt like a kind of home I had never known before. My parents tried to reach out through a lawyer. They wanted to arrange a meeting to talk, to apologize, maybe even to negotiate some kind of truce. I declined. I wrote a letter instead, not for them to read, but for me to write. I poured out every word I had never been allowed to say, every truth I had buried for years, and when I was done, I burned it on my balcony, watching the smoke rise into the night sky. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was release. I visited my grandmother's grave, the one person who had ever truly loved me unconditionally. She had passed away in 2007, but I still remembered her voice, her warm hands, her quiet strength. I sat beside her headstone and told her everything, like she could hear me, like she was proud. And somehow I believed she was. I left a single white flower before I walked away, and it felt like closing a chapter gently instead of slamming it shut. People sometimes ask me now, what would you tell someone going through what you went through? And I always say the same thing: believe yourself when no one else does. Protect your truth, even when it costs you everything. And never forget that surviving is not just an act of endurance, it is an act of rebellion. I went back to school, registered for a few online classes, not because I had to, but because I wanted to reclaim the things that were once stolen from me. I picked subjects that made my brain spark again: literature, social psychology, media, ethics. I wrote papers that bled honesty, and professors took notice. One even offered to recommend me for a writing fellowship, and I smiled thinking of how far I had come from the girl who once sat in that same classroom feeling invisible. I started volunteering at a center that worked with at-risk youth, kids who had been through systems that failed them, who had grown up thinking pain was normal. I shared my story carefully, not all the details, but enough to show them that survival was possible, that their voices mattered too. And in their eyes, I saw a reflection of who I used to be, scared, but still fighting. One day after group, a girl named Maya pulled me aside and said, "I thought I was broken until I heard you talk, and now I think maybe I am just healing." I hugged her tight and told her healing is messy, but it is always worth it. On the anniversary of the final court ruling, I lit a candle, not in celebration, but in remembrance of who I had been and who I had become. I stood in my living room with the lights off, the flame flickering, and thought about every version of myself that had carried me to this moment: the angry girl, the silent girl, the brave girl, the tired girl. And I whispered, "Thank you to each one of them because I would not be here without them. I sat on the park bench with my hands wrapped around a paper cup of hot tea, letting the steam rise into my face while my thoughts swirled with memories and unanswered questions. I had made it through the storm, but now came the long road of understanding everything that had happened and what it meant for my future. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that courtroom, the pale walls, the hard wooden benches, the way my parents rolled their eyes like my pain was nothing more than an inconvenience, the way the judge looked at me with a mixture of shock and disbelief, not because of what I had done, but because of what I had survived, and how I stood there refusing to break. I never expected justice to feel so hollow, not because I lost, but because even in victory, I felt the heavy silence of what could never be repaired. I still remembered the exact moment the judge dropped his pen, leaned back, and stared at my parents as if seeing them for the first time, with no sympathy in his eyes and no patience left in his voice. I remembered thinking maybe this was the beginning of something real, something irreversible, like a crack in a wall that could never be sealed again. The days after the trial moved slowly. I stayed indoors for a while, just trying to breathe again. Like every inhale was a new chance to claim space I had once shrunk away from. I cleaned the apartment again, not out of nervous energy, but because I needed to feel in control of at least one thing in my life. I sorted my closet, donated old clothes, threw out things that reminded me of the past, and stood in front of the mirror wondering what version of myself I would become now that I was no longer hiding. I looked at my reflection and whispered, "You made it through, and no one can take that away from you." I began writing more fillings, page after page, with the kind of truth I had once been too scared to say out loud. I wrote about betrayal, about the cold distance in my parents' eyes, about the nights I cried myself to sleep with a pillow over my mouth so no one could hear. I wrote about the guilt that lingered even though I knew I had done nothing wrong, and the strange relief of finally telling the truth no matter the cost. And once I started writing, I could not stop because the words had power and I had found my voice again. I took long walks through neighborhoods I had never explored, letting the wind and the sky remind me that the world was bigger than my pain. I watched children chase each other through playgrounds, their laughter filling the air, and I remembered a time when I used to laugh like that too, before life taught me to be careful with joy, before I learned to be suspicious of love. I visited a bookstore and wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of novels, memoirs, histories, each title like a promise that other people had also endured and come out on the other side. I bought a book about rebuilding self-trust and spent the entire afternoon reading it on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket with the sun on my face. I called an old professor who had once told me I was meant to change the world, and when I told him everything, he did not flinch or offer shallow comfort. He just said, "I believe you and I am proud of you," and that was enough to make me cry again, but this time the tears felt like cleansing, like something was finally leaving my body that had no place in it anymore. I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self. I made a list of things I had always wanted to try and started checking them off one by one. I took a pottery class and laughed when my bowl came out lopsided. I learned to cook meals that filled my apartment with warmth. I visited an art museum and stood for a long time in front of a painting that made me feel seen even though it was centuries old. I even took a dance class, and though my steps were clumsy, I felt alive in a way I had not felt in years. I began to reconnect with people who had supported me quietly throughout the chaos, friends who had sent messages even when I had not responded, cousins who had never taken sides but had always believed in me. I met with them slowly, one at a time, over coffee or dinner, and we talked not just about the past but about the future, and it felt like planting seeds in soil that had once been scorched. I knew not all relationships could be saved, and I made peace with that too. I received a letter from my father one day, left under my door, no return address, no name on the envelope, just his handwriting, shaky and uncertain. He wrote that he had watched the trial again from the recordings, that he did not recognize the man he had become, that he was sorry for what he had allowed, for what he had denied, for what he had encouraged, and that he understood if I never wanted to see him again. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer, not because I forgave him, but because I needed to decide what to do with it in my own time. Forgiveness was not a door I was ready to walk through yet, and maybe I never would, And that was okay too. I started therapy again. And this time I talked about the parts I had hidden even from myself, the moments where I doubted my own reality, where I wondered if maybe I had imagined it all, the fear of speaking up, the guilt of breaking the silence, the pain of watching my parents choose denial over love. My therapist listened without interruption and helped me untangle the shame from the truth, helped me see that survival was not weakness but strength, that reclaiming my life was not selfish but sacred. I began to dream again, not the kind of dreams that came in sleep, but the kind that lived in the spaces where hope dared to return. I dreamed of writing a book, of starting a non-profit, of traveling to cities where no one knew my name. I dreamed of living without fear, of loving without apology, of waking up each morning without that heavy knot in my chest that used to live there. I dreamed of becoming someone my younger self would be proud of. And every step I took brought me closer to her. I enrolled in an online course in trauma-informed advocacy and started learning how to help others who had walked through fires like mine. I joined forums where survivors shared their stories and offered encouragement. I wrote articles under a pseudonym that were picked up by small publications, and slowly people began reaching out asking, "How did you survive? How did you stay strong?" And I always told them the truth. I did not always feel strong, but I kept going because stopping was not an option, because even when my voice shook, I knew I had to speak. Because I owed it to the girl I used to be to not give up on the woman I was becoming. I went back to the courthouse once, not for a case, but for closure. I stood outside the doors where everything had changed, where the world had finally heard my truth, and I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of city wash over me. I whispered thank you to the version of me who had walked through those doors alone, who had stood in front of the judge with her heart pounding and her hands steady, who had told the truth even when her voice broke. I walked away not with sadness, but with clarity. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me. I was defined by what I chose to do with it, and I chose to live fully, loudly, fiercely. I knew the road ahead would still have its shadows, still have days where the past crept in through the cracks, but I also knew I had the strength now to face it, to name it, and rise above it, not because I had all the answers, but because I had finally stopped running and started living. The morning sun broke through the half-open blinds and painted soft lines across my floor, but even with its golden light I felt no warmth, because I knew what the day ahead meant, the memories it would stir, and the choices it would demand. I stood in front of my closet staring at my clothes longer than I needed to, because nothing felt right, not the shirt I wore when I graduated, not the coat I used to borrow from my father, not the cardigan that reminded me of my mother's quiet glances. I finally pulled out a plain black blouse and dark jeans, simple, clean, unassuming, because I was not dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing like armor, a way to remind myself that I had already survived worse than this. I sat on the edge of the bed and tied my shoes slowly, methodically, each knot a breath, each pull a grounding, before I stood and looked at myself in the mirror, telling my reflection, "You do not need their approval, you only need your truth." I walked to the courthouse alone again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to reclaim every step, every door, every hallway I had once walked through with trembling hands and a heavy heart. This time I walked tall, not out of pride, but out of defiance, because they had taken enough from me, and I was not giving them my posture too. The clerk at the front desk recognized me, nodded gently, and handed me the folder without a word, the kind of respect that comes from seeing someone rise again and again when they were supposed to fall. I took the elevator to the third floor and waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall, while the seconds ticked by, and the memories played behind my eyes. The first time I had stood here, I had been scared, unsure of what justice meant, and whether it would ever come for someone like me. Now I understood that justice was not just a ruling, it was a reclamation, a way to take back your voice, even if no one else applauded. I stepped into the small meeting room and sat down across from the mediator, a woman with kind eyes and a sharp mind. She opened the file, flipped through the pages, and said, "We are just here to finalize things today. Are you ready?" And I nodded yes, because there was nothing left to fear. Not now, not after everything. She laid out the papers carefully, one by one, and explained each term as if I were hearing it for the first time, and maybe I was, maybe now that I had distance from Storm, I could finally understand what these words meant, what they protected, what they promised. She asked if I had any questions, and I said just one, do I have to see them again? And she looked at me and said only if you want to, and I felt the tightness in my chest loosen, because finally I had a choice. The door opened then, and my parents stepped in together, their eyes sweeping over me like I was a stranger, and maybe to them I was someone they no longer recognized, one they had not expected to fight so hard, to speak so loudly. They sat down across from me, and the silence stretched thick between us, not hostile, not warm, just empty like a bridge long since burned. The mediator began walking through the agreements, pointing to each line and asking us to initial. I watched my father scribble his name quickly, as if trying to rush through the discomfort, and I watched my mother pause on each word as if trying to understand how it had come to this. I took my pen and signed each page slowly, deliberately, because I wanted every mark to say I was here, I mattered, I survived. We reached the final page, and the mediator said, "This is it. Once we sign here, it is done." And for a moment I hesitated, not because I had doubts, but because this page, this line, this moment marked the end of a chapter that had nearly broken me. I signed it anyway because my healing mattered more than their denial. When it was over, my parents stood to leave, and my mother looked at me with eyes that wanted to say something, but lips that refused to move. My father just turned and walked away like the man he had always been, absent, present, cold. I stayed seated, watching the door close behind them, and for the first time I did not feel abandoned. I felt freed. The mediator smiled softly and said, "You did well," and I thanked her quietly, because I knew the real victory was not the paper, not the agreement, not even the silence. It was the peace I carried out of that room, the unshakable knowing that I had stood up for myself. When it mattered most, I left the courthouse and stepped into the late afternoon sun, letting it warm my skin. As I walked down the steps and out onto the street, people passed me by, busy with their own lives, unaware that something monumental had just happened, not in headlines, not in public spectacle, but in the quiet resolve of one woman who had refused to stay broken. I took a long way home, passing the bakery that used to be my favorite before everything happened. I walked by the playground where I had once scraped my knee as a child, and cried until my father picked me up and promised to make it better. Funny how time turned those moments into fragments, memories that no longer held the same meaning. I passed the library and paused outside the window, watching a little girl inside flipping through a picture book with wide eyes and messy hair, and I thought, I hope no one ever tells her to quiet down, to shrink, to disappear, because girls like her deserve to grow up unafraid. I kept walking until I reached the park where I had once sat after the trial, trying to make sense of what had happened. I found the same bench and sat down again, letting the stillness wrap around me. This time I was not searching for clarity, I was claiming it. I pulled out my journal and began to write, not about pain, not about survival, but about what came next, about the possibilities that now stretched before me like an open road. I wrote about wanting to help others, about starting a foundation for those who had no voice, about building something from the ashes that could actually matter. I wrote about love, not the romantic kind, but the kind that starts within, the kind that says, "I see you, I hear you, I will not abandon you." I wrote about joy, the kind that shows up quietly after grief has had its say, the kind that sneaks in through small moments like warm tea and good books and safe hands. I closed the journal and sat in silence, breathing deep, watching the wind play with the leaves above me, feeling the weight of everything I had carried slowly lift, not all at once, but enough to remind me that I was lighter now. I walked home under a sky painted in gold and pink, and when I reached my apartment, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and smiled because it felt like mine in a way it never had before. I made dinner, simple pasta with roasted vegetables, and played music in the background, letting it fill the room with warmth and rhythm. I danced a little while stirring the sauce, not because I was good at it, but because I could, because no one was watching, no one was judging, and even if they were, I did not care. I ate at the table with a candle lit, not for romance, but for ritual, because healing deserves ceremony. I washed the dishes, slowly humming to myself, and when I climbed into bed later that night, I pulled the covers around me and whispered, "You did it," not because everything was perfect, but because I had faced the worst and lived, and tomorrow I would wake up and do it again, not for them, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for me, because I was worth saving, and now I knew it. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in my apartment as I sat motionless on the couch, clutching the letter in my hand, reading it over and over again. Even though I had memorized every word from the first moment, my eyes touched the page. It was not just ink and paper, it was a storm. Confrontation, a decision that shattered whatever fragile peace I had built over the past few weeks. My hands trembled, but not from fear. This time it was something deeper, something older. It was the ache of years of silence finally cracking open. My mother had written to me. I did not know what had prompted it, perhaps guilt or curiosity, or maybe simply the weight of her own shame had grown too loud to ignore. Either way, the letter had arrived unannounced, slipped under my door like a secret. Not ready to face the light, her handwriting was familiar, too familiar, and that in itself was a wound I had not prepared for. She wrote about the past, about the courtroom, about how she and my father had struggled to understand my choices, as if the pain they had caused could be reduced to misunderstandings and confusion. She never apologized, not directly. Instead, she offered phrases like, "We did what we thought was right, and we hope one day you will see it differently," and maybe in her mind that counted as an olive branch. But to me it was just another way to shift the blame. I stared at the letter until the words blurred, and then I stood and ripped it slowly, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Because I would not let her rewrite history in her favor, not after everything. I tossed the pieces into the trash, and then walked to the window, watching the city breathe, watching strangers pass below, unaware of the war that had just raged quietly in one apartment above them. I knew what I had to do. I picked up my phone and dialed the number that had not changed in years, even though I had never called it until now. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, cautious, surprised hello. And I said, "It is me," my voice steady, my resolve sharp. There was a pause, and then my mother said, "I wondered if you would call," and I said, "I read your letter, and I need to say something face to face, not over the phone, not through another wall of words." We agreed to meet in the park near the courthouse, a place that had once been haunted for me, but now felt neutral, a battlefield cleared after the war. I arrived early, sitting on the same bench where I had once wept after the judge delivered the verdict that finally acknowledged my pain, the bench where I had made a promise to myself that I would never be silent again. My mother arrived 5 minutes later, her steps slow, her expression unreadable. She looked older. Then I remembered, smaller too, like time had pressed down on her in ways I had not noticed before. She sat beside me, leaving a respectful space between us, and we sat in silence for a long while, listening to the wind move through the trees. I finally said, "I do not want excuses, and I do not want justifications. I want you to hear me, really hear me, and then I want you to decide if you are capable of accepting the truth." She nodded, but said nothing, and so I began. I told her everything, not just the facts, not just the timeline, but the emotions, the betrayals, the moments I had begged for her to see me and she had turned away. I told her how I had questioned my own worth because of the way she and my father had dismissed my pain, how I had thought for years that maybe I deserved the silence, maybe I had imagined it all. I told her about the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions, the moments I stood in front of mirrors trying to convince myself that I mattered, that I was not broken, and she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears that slid down her cheeks as I spoke. And when I finished, she whispered, "I did not know," and I said, "You chose not to know, and that is not the same thing." She looked at her hands, twisting them in her lap, and said, "I failed you and I cannot fix that, but I am here now, and if you will let me, I want to try to be better. I want to learn how to love you the way you always deserved to be loved." And something in me softened, not forgiveness, not yet, but something I could not name, a loosening, a breath I had been holding for far too long. We talked for another hour, not about the past, but about the now, about the cautious rebuilding of something that had once been destroyed. She did not ask for more than I could give, and I respected her for that. We parted with a tentative hug, not warm, not cold, just human, and I walked away feeling lighter, not because everything was healed, but because something had begun to shift. I returned home and opened my laptop, clicking through the emails until I found the one I had been avoiding, the one from the foundation I had applied to months ago, offering me a chance to speak at their annual summit. A gathering of survivors, advocates, professionals, all sharing stories of resilience and change. I had hesitated before because I was not sure I was ready to put my story into the world. Not like that, not on a stage, but now I realized that readiness was a myth we created to delay our courage. I replied with a simple yes, and then leaned back, feeling the thrill of a door opening, a new path unfolding over the next few weeks. I prepared for the event, crafting my speech, rehearsing it, refining it, until every word felt like it belonged to me, not to my pain, not to my past, but to the woman I had become. I stood backstage on the day of the summit, heart racing, palms sweaty, the room buzzing with energy. And when my name was called, I walked onto the stage and faced the audience, a sea of faces, each holding their own stories, their own battles. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them not just what had happened to me, but what it had taught me, how it had shaped me, how it had nearly broken me, but ultimately built me stronger. I spoke about silence and about the power of speaking anyway, about rejection and the strength of reclaiming your worth. I spoke about the long, hard road of healing and how it does not happen all at once, but in pieces, in breaths, in decisions. I ended by saying, we do not heal to forget, we heal to remember without hurting. And the room stood clapping, not just for me, but for every story that echoed through mine. After the summit, I was approached by a young girl, maybe 17, eyes wide, voice shaking. She said, thank you for saying what I could not. And I hugged her because I knew what it meant to feel voiceless, and I promised myself I would keep speaking for her, for me, for all of us. Had once been silenced. I returned home that night, exhausted but full, my heart stretched wide, my voice no longer trembling. And as I sat by the window watching the stars blink into the night sky, I knew that something irreversible had happened. I was no longer surviving, I was living. When I opened the door to the auditorium and stepped into the soft golden lights that stretched across the rows of silent faces, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind born after surviving a storm, the kind that comes when you have already faced the worst and somehow you are still standing. I adjusted the microphone, took one breath, and began speaking without hesitation, without fear, because everything I had lived through had led to this moment, and I would not waste it. I spoke about pain and silence and the long dark tunnel of loneliness that had tried to choke me for years. I told them how it started slowly, like water dripping on stone, how I ignored the warning signs, how I convinced myself I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive, too emotional, too needy, and how that lie grew roots in me until I started to believe it myself. I told them how the people I trusted most treated me like an inconvenience, like a problem that needed fixing, how I spent nights staring at the ceiling wishing I could disappear, and then mornings pretending I was fine. I painted every detail, not for sympathy, but for truth, because truth had become my greatest weapon and I had learned how to use it. I watched as faces in the crowd changed, as eyes filled with tears, as hands clasped tightly, as silence grew heavy, not with discomfort, but with understanding. I told them about the courtroom, the smell of wood polish and fear, how my parents rolled their eyes when I walked in, how they looked at me like I was a stranger, or worse, a disappointment, how the judge looked at me and saw what they refused to see. I described the moment I stood in front of that bench, my voice shaking but my resolve unbreakable, and how I told the truth, not just about what happened, but about how it felt, how it haunted me, how it reshaped everything I thought I knew about love and family and safety. I spoke of the verdict, the stillness that followed, the way the world tilted slightly like it had finally shifted into place, and how afterward I sat alone on a bench outside and cried, not because I lost or won, but because I had spoken and survived. I told them how I rebuilt myself piece by piece, starting with the smallest acts of rebellion, like speaking up, like saying no, like daring to believe I deserved better. I spoke of therapy and journals and long walks at night. I told them about the letter my mother sent, the one filled with regrets, but not apologies, the one that tried to explain the unexplainable, and how I tore it up not out of hatred, but because I could not let it rewrite the truth I had fought so hard to tell. I told them about the park, meeting the silent, the words that passed between us, the ache in her voice, the way she said I did not know, and the way I said you chose not to know, because that difference mattered. I told them I did not forgive her, not then, maybe not ever, but I listened, and I let her try, and sometimes that is more powerful forgiveness. I told them about the summit, the moment I stood backstage, heart pounding, sweat running down my spine, and how I walked onto that stage anyway because I had learned that bravery is not the absence of fear but walking through it. I described the girl who approached me afterward, eyes wide, voice trembling, saying thank you for saying what I could not, and how I held her hands and said your voice matters too. I told them about the job I took helping others like me, the calls, the letters, the quiet victories. I told them about the night I sat alone in my apartment and realized I was no longer afraid of my own reflection, that I no longer saw a victim or a survivor, but simply myself. I described the freedom of that realization, the quiet joy of it, the peace that finally arrived, not all at once, but like dawn, slow and soft and certain. I told them that healing is not a destination, but a direction, that sometimes you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that is still progress. I told them that their story matters, even if it is messy, even if it is complicated, even if no one clapped at the end. I told them that speaking their truth would not always be easy, but it would always be worth it. When I finished, the room erupted, not just in applause, but in a roar of something deeper, a collective release, a shared understanding. I stepped off the stage and felt arms wrap around me, strangers whose names I did not know, but whose hearts now echoed mine, and I realized I had become a part of something larger than myself. I had become a voice among voices, a light in the dark, a reminder that we are never truly alone. I spent hours after the talk answering questions, sharing more, hugging people who said your story is my story. I left that night tired but fulfilled, my heart stretched full. I walked through the city under streetlights, feeling the cool wind against my face, and I knew that I had done something that mattered. The next morning, I woke to emails, messages, letters from people around the world, some sharing their own stories, some just saying thank you, and I read every single one, tears falling again, but this time from something softer, something kinder. My mother called that afternoon, her voice small, asking how it went, and I told her the truth. I told her it was beautiful and hard and necessary, and that I was proud of myself. She said, I am proud of you too, and maybe she meant it. Maybe she was trying. I did not ask for more. I did not need more. Sometimes a single sentence can carry the weight of 1,000 apologies. I continued my work, not because I wanted to be a hero, but because I had learned that stories are bridges, and every time we tell the truth we lay down one more stone. I helped organize events, wrote articles, mentored others. I used every ounce of pain I had carried to build something better, not perfect, but better. I started sleeping through the night without nightmares. I started laughing more, trusting more, loving more. I stood in front of mirrors and saw strength, not scars. I walked into rooms and did not shrink. I claimed space unapologetically. I began to live, not in spite of what happened, but because I had survived it and decided it would not define me. I found new friends, family of choice, people who celebrated me, who saw me, who stood beside me. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I let go of people who drained me, who doubted me, who dismissed me, and I did not feel guilty about it. I learned that boundaries are not walls, but doors, and I had the right to close them whenever I needed to. I began writing a book, not just about what happened, but about what came after, the messy, hard, beautiful truth of healing. I wrote it for the girl I once was, and for the girl in the audience who needed someone to go first, and for every person who ever wondered if they would make it through. The answer is yes, not because it is easy, but because it is possible, because you are stronger than you know and more deserving than you believe. I titled the book with the same words that had once felt like a curse. My mom and dad rolled their eyes when I entered the courtroom, but the judge was stunned because those words no longer hurt. They were part of the story, but not the end of it. I dedicated the book to survivors everywhere, and I meant it with every part of me. The day the book was published, I held it in my hands and cried again, not from sadness, but from pride, from awe, from the weight of it all. I hosted a small launch, surrounded by friends, by new family, by people who had seen me rise, and I gave a speech, short but full of heart. I said I used to think my voice was too small, but now I know it is powerful, and it is mine, and I will never silence it again. And the room erupted again, not just for me, but for all of us who dared to speak. I ended that night with a quiet moment alone, sitting on the same park bench from before, the one where I had once sat shattered and now sat whole. I looked up at the stars and whispered thank you to the girl who kept going even when it hurt, especially when it hurt, and I promised her I would keep going 2. It felt like everything that had led me to this moment was crashing together inside me as I walked toward the final stretch of the courtroom's tension-soaked silence. I could feel every gaze turning like spotlights weighing down my shoulders, but I held my head high and locked eyes with the judge. He looked from me to the bailiff and then to the pile of documents already mounting on the bench. The air itself was heavy like a storm cloud about to burst, but I could feel the storm was mine now, not theirs. The judge cleared his throat slowly, and with a tone that carried more curiosity than authority asked me to explain what had really gone on behind all the theatrics, accusations, and assumptions that had dominated the last several weeks. I could sense my mother and father watching from behind their crossed arms and skeptical stares, probably still hoping I would choke or break or stumble, but I had walked through fire to reach this point, and I had no intention of being the one who flinched. I told the judge everything from the beginning, from the first awkward moment, when I had walked into my internship at the law firm and realized my cousin was planted there to sabotage me. The nights I stayed up reviewing case files, not for praise but just to keep ahead of the traps being laid around me, to the carefully orchestrated plan I had built not just to survive, but to expose them. I laid out every manipulation and lie and scheme, and how I had documented it all, how I had hidden backup copies in public cloud drives under disguised names, how I had audio recordings proving collusion, and emails that showed deliberate attempts to destroy my career. Before it could even begin, the judge blinked slowly, his hands folding one over the other as he nodded his head carefully, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that suddenly made a lot more sense. I could hear the uncomfortable shifting of my parents behind me, probably realizing that this courtroom drama was not the one they thought they had walked into. I kept going, recounting how when I had been offered a key role on a major case, my cousin had falsely reported me to human resources for misconduct, knowing it would tie me up in internal investigations just long enough to miss the deadline, how my name had been tarnished in hushed office whispers and sly glances in the elevator, and how even then I never struck back. Out of anger, I simply kept receipts, all of them, and planned for a day like today. I described the day I had been removed from that case, and the following week when I had met quietly with one of the firm's senior partners who had mentored me early on, and how I showed him the chain of evidence he had been horrified not just at the betrayal, but at how deeply my cousin had embedded themselves into the system, and how many allies they had drawn into their web of falsehoods. The judge interrupted, gently asking me how I had ensured the authenticity of the evidence, and I explained I had used blockchain verification for every audio file and digital timestamping for all emails. I had kept each document unedited and preserved on a third-party secure archive that was reviewed by a licensed forensic data analyst who had also submitted an affidavit. It included in the evidence stack before the court. Nodded slowly and looked at the opposing counsel, whose face had turned an odd shade of disbelief. I then detailed how I had chosen not to press criminal charges first, but instead to request a hearing to clear my professional name, because I believed in the power of law when used with integrity, not revenge. How my goal was not to destroy my cousin, but to ensure they never destroyed anyone else's future the way they tried with mine. The judge then glanced at the panel of firm partners seated as official observers and asked if anyone wished to challenge the evidence. That silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. I could hear the whispers of my parents behind me turn into silence too, their smug indifference now replaced with something heavier. I kept going, methodically showing how even the firm's internal memos matched the timeline of my claims, and how inconsistencies in my cousin's accounts had already raised red flags weeks ago, how I had followed every policy, never breaking a rule, even when the system seemed designed to break me. I explained how I had kept going because this was not just about me, but about proving to others watching that being underestimated is not a weakness, but a weapon, if you know how to use it. The judge leaned back, looked over at my cousin, who now looked nothing like the polished, smug saboteur from earlier weeks. Instead, they looked cornered, drained, and smaller than I had ever seen them before. The judge then asked the firm's managing partner to step forward and address the court, which he did with a voice far less certain than usual. He said the firm would launch a full internal audit effective immediately, and that my cousin would be suspended pending formal review. He also said that my performance had always been exceptional, and that the firm regretted not recognizing the hostile environment I had endured sooner. He said my record would be publicly cleared, and I would be reinstated with full honors and invited to join the leadership track. I turned only slightly to see my mother and father looking stunned, mouths open but silent. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I simply turned back to the judge and said, "Thank you, I have nothing further to add." The judge nodded slowly, and with a firmness that echoed through the room, said, "This court finds no basis for the claims against you and acknowledges the misconduct presented here today. This hearing is adjourned, and may this serve as a reminder that truth, when pursued with diligence, patience, and strength, is always louder than gossip, louder than envy, louder than even blood ties." And with that the gavel came down, and I felt the moment like thunder, not just in the room, but in my chest, in my bones, in the very path that had brought me here. I gathered my files, slowly letting the weight of victory settle, not as joy, but as earned peace. As I walked down the courtroom aisle, I passed by my parents, who said nothing, their faces pale and unreadable, and I knew that this silence was different than the one they had offered me before. This one was full of realization and shame, and perhaps a little fear. I exited the courthouse into a sky that looked a little brighter than before, and I did not look back, not because I was bitter, but because forward was only direction left for me now. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.